Before the advent of social media, I remember loving watching the sports shows at the end of the day, and you'd see the top 10 plays of the day, or maybe the top 10 bloopers of the day as well. Those were fun to watch too. What you're seeing in this week's reading is a highlight for the disciples, but also one of those lowlights for the disciples, because after a really good moment, it gets kind of rough. Here's the good moment. Christ asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Well, that's chapter 9 of Luke's gospel. And as we move further into chapter 9, verse 28, we see this transfiguration of Jesus. Some 8 days later, verse 28, after these sayings, he took Peter and John and James, and he went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of Jesus' face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, just imagine this scenario. One, Jesus appears in glory, but also here he is with Moses and Elijah, 2 men who shouldn't be there because they lived a really long time ago and have since gone to heaven. How is it that they're there? How is it that, as we'll see in a second, that the disciples even realize that it's Moses and Elijah? But they're talking with Jesus about Jesus's departure from Jerusalem. Verse 32, now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep. So you've got this miraculous moment, and the disciples are sleeping through it. But they come to, and they're fully awake. They saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. And as the men were leaving, Peter says to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." And Luke tells us that Peter doesn't realize what he's saying. While Peter's saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Then this voice comes out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. An odd occurrence. Continues to get odd. On the next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met them, and a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only son." Now notice the comparison here. You've just had a voice from heaven declaring, "This is my son," talking about Jesus. And then you have this person approaching Jesus who says, "Lord, I beg you, this is my son." And he says that a spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams, and it throws him into a convulsion with foaming at the mouth, and only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. "And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they couldn't." And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." That's not the kindest response, maybe would be our reaction. But while he was still approaching, the demon slammed the boy to the ground and threw him into a convulsion. Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. But while everyone was marveling at all that he was doing, he's got a message for his disciples who had just seen the transfiguration of Jesus, but were told not to tell about it, who'd just seen this healing from the demoniac when they couldn't do it. They'd been chastised by Jesus for not being able to. He says this, "Let these words sink into your ears. For the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." Now, anytime Jesus says, "Let these words sink into your ears," you better pay attention. It's an odd contrast. Jesus there before Moses and Elijah, we hear the voice of the Father saying, "This is my son." Well, what does Jesus do when he's faced with the same situation where someone else saying, "This is my son"? He has compassion and he heals and he delivers and he rescues. So what would we assume then that the Father is going to do for his son? Well, he's going to let him be delivered into the hands of men. That doesn't make much sense. The disciples, verse 45, they didn't understand the statement, and it was concealed from them so that they would not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about the statement. Now the question is, why couldn't they have understood it? Now there are a few possibilities. Why was it concealed? Did God conceal it from them? Did Satan conceal it from them? Were they, by their own lack of faith or lack of diligence, concealing it from themselves? All are possibilities. How would we know? Well, we do like the scripture says, and we let these words sink into our ears. So keep reading.